Thank you for joining us this week on the Law of Relevancy. I'm your host, Cord Zoen, and today we're joined by Ron Green. He's one of the co-founders at KUNGFU.AI, someone with decades of experience programming and developing and building solutions for some of the biggest companies in the world using AI. Ron, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you. You're like the wise old wizard of AI in my book. It's you don't get to talk to people very often who've been working in artificial intelligence since the 90s.
Yeah, it is. It's a really exciting time for some of the old people like me who've been doing this long enough that we remembered when just getting the systems to work even a little bit reliably was, a really, really huge success.
That's actually a really important point because, AI, artificial intelligence, has been around for a while. And really, a lot of times when people are talking about how it's been used, it's like pattern matching, pattern recognition, like predicting what's going to happen next or the likelihood of something happening. That type of technology has been around for a while. And that's, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that's really in kind of the domain of like machine learning, right? Classification, those types of things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Took big teams.
It did. The real difference is we've had predictive systems for a long time, and you can go back decades and you can look at things like time series analysis or regression models, or even things like logistic regression, which goes back decades. The difference with those models is they were really all about sort of parameter fitting in an area, and parameter fitting is just kind of a fancy term for meaning you're trying to fit the model to the data. You're trying to have the model understand and generalize on the data. The challenge back then was the ability to work on complex domains was all but zero. So you could build models that might be able to predict housing prices by curve fitting and things like that. The ability to work in computer vision and understand images or videos or understand natural language processing was just absolutely rudimentary until the last 10 years. And that's all because of this explosion in the machine learning technique, which is, machine learning is a type of AI, and the machine learning technique is the idea that you can train models, these computer programs, to learn to perform a task by showing it examples and the right answer, and then it learns over time to generalize. And so that has been the real big change within AI, this idea that things that are relatively easy for us, like recognizing images or understanding speech, were impossible for computers because we couldn't introspect our brains. We couldn't understand how we were doing it. We still actually don't understand how humans do it at a deep way, but we can now use these models and train them on the data, and they learn to generalize. And so they're just orders of magnitude more accurate and more predictive than previous approaches in pretty much every domain.
I want to dig into everything you just said, but before we get to some of the stuff that's coming, I'd like to talk about something you just mentioned where you're talking about computer vision. Mm-hmm. And over the last 10 years, I think one of the areas where we've seen the greatest impact to humanity is radiologists being assisted by AI models, looking at X-ray scans and scans of your body and whatnot, detecting things that you might not have been able to catch as a human.
Right. This is going to be one of the big areas of development, and I think that a lot of people, even some of the people working in with the AI field, don't understand just what a sea change is about to happen. We're already seeing that. So I'll give you a couple examples. One, we developed a breast cancer risk prediction model. And what's really interesting about this is it's not detecting breast cancer because it's looking at mammograms. These are X-rays, and there is no breast cancer. This is not a detection model. Those do exist as well. This is a risk prediction model. And this is a much, much harder problem. And it's based upon decades of longitudinal data, meaning data where we have patients that had clear mammogram radiology appointments and then over time developed cancer. And we were able to take and develop a computer vision model that looked at terabytes. I mean, this is just an unimaginable amount of radiological data across continents. We have data from Europe, South America, and North America, and train a model, and it can accurately predict breast cancer risk in women up to 5 years in advance at a level that is orders of magnitude beyond the state of the art. And what's great about that is getting early warnings and getting women visibility into the probability that they might get cancer is really important, because it can dictate the type of repeat visits you have, the frequency, and it can help you catch some of these things early in your lifestyle. And that model, what's amazing about it is it's literally superhuman. We don't know what it's picking up on. It is picking up on purely biological signals, meaning it is only looking at the images. It is not looking at any other data about the patient whatsoever, and it can still predict a breast cancer risk. And it's picking up on something that the humans just can't see.
That's incredible that you've built this model. It works to a large degree.
Yep.
Yet we don't exactly know what it's doing. That's unbelievable.
It is, and it is. Candidly, it's a little frustrating as a practitioner, because these techniques that we use, which are within the machine learning field within AI, the dominant technique is something called deep learning, and it's basically like a supervised approach to building models, where you, as I said, you show it examples, and then in the beginning the model knows nothing. It makes some random guesses, and then you correct it and you tell it what the answer should have been. And then over time, if you have a good set of data, and that what constitutes a good set of data can vary based upon the problem, but the model can learn to generalize. But even if the model can reach 100% accuracy, it can be very, very difficult to look inside the model and introspect it, because it has so many different parameters. We're talking about hundreds of billions to trillions of parameters now. And a parameter means a variable that it learned, that was initially at a random value, and it learned to set all these variables to something collectively so that it can be predictive. But it can be almost impossible to know exactly how it's making its decisions.
And then from a professional services standpoint, working on a project like that, I imagine, because you mentioned it's decades of data across the world, you're probably using a huge variety of equipment that have produced these scans at different resolutions and with different contrasts and all of those sorts of things, to where there's probably a lot of work in getting it to a point, I assume, to where you can use the data in a way that you have some consistency in how the model's getting trained as well.
That is absolutely right. And one of the challenges we ran into that made it even more difficult is, understandably, within healthcare, we want privacy, and so we take that unbelievably seriously at KUNGFU.AI. And some of the data sets we worked with were completely de-identified, and so it would not matter how they were used. And others were not. Others were actually still within clinical facilities. And so in those instances, it was not acceptable that the data would ever leave the premise. So we actually built something called a federated learning system, and that allows data to stay in its location, basically at rest, secure, and we pushed parts of the model to the edge, to different parts of the cloud. And we did this in different parts of different data centers around the globe. And then these different models were then averaged with a master model, and that's how it learned to generalize across these kind of crazy different data sets. But I will add, building a state-of-the-art computer vision model to predict the risk of breast cancer at a superhuman level is an extreme case of modern AI. We also do a lot of other work, and a lot of other companies are doing work that is not as demanding from a technical perspective in AI and from a data perspective. So, for example, if you were trying to do fraud detection or sales churn prediction, or even doing things like price optimization or product recommendation, the amount of data and the complexity involved in a product like that would not be nearly as high.
Yeah, and sometimes you get the data and it's in really good shape, like if you're working with a bank. where regulations have forced the data to be homogenous for years and years, or an insurance company, or there might be like other medical data, or research data where by default it's already organized. Going in, they knew that they were going to organize it. So I'm sure you get to see all kinds of varieties of data when you get started with some of these projects.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. In fact, one of our earliest customers, we were really excited. This was going to be a model to help them essentially do price optimization and churn minimization on the sales side. And we launched and we kicked the project off, and it was almost a week later we had to shut it down because they didn't realize internally that some of their IT department, to save money, had been deleting data after 6 months. So they were sitting on this gold mine, they thought, of a decade of proprietary data within their vertical space, and didn't realize they were dating it, or were deleting it. And so we literally couldn't move forward with that. And so I always like to say there's this old Chinese proverb about the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, and the second best time is today. The same thing with data. You may not know exactly what you're going to do in AI in the future. That's okay. You can get started today, making sure you have good data practices in place and that you're keeping and collecting the data that is proprietary to your domain, because it will be valuable to you down the line.
That's an interesting point, because if I were to start an AI project today, there are processes, procedures, policies, just the way we've done business leading up to today that might even create bias in my data based off of the results. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't do it.
Right. So that's a great question. So the whole bias issue is a major issue with the type of technique that we're talking about, which again is really the dominant technique, this supervised learning approach. I'm kind of glad you touched on this. So a couple points. One is, old guys like me working in, AI in the 90s, we weren't worried about bias or ethical issues. We were just trying to get the damn thing to work. Right? We were just we weren't sure we were even on the right path, using neural networks and things like that. Now that it's working, it's kind of analogous to what happened with the internet. The internet researchers in the 60s and 70s and 80s were just trying to get it to work. And then once it was deployed broadly, they layered on security, and it was sort of an afterthought. AI, to a greater or lesser extent, has kind of experienced the same thing. We are only, as an industry, I think, really beginning to appreciate the ethical and biased issues in a serious way. And a couple points on that. One is, if you, just like you said, if you take a data set and you train a model on that data set, whatever type of bias, whether it was intentional or otherwise, will be learned by that model. It will learn to replicate that bias. So if you had some type of ethical discrimination, let's say you're talking about like a real estate data set that goes back decades, and you train a model on that, it will perpetrate that bias. And you cannot have the model make predictions and then say, well, this model is completely indifferent. It doesn't see color. It's unbiased. No, it actually is. It's looking at the bias in the data. But that said, you can actually mitigate that. You can do bias analysis. There are really powerful techniques that you can use now. So you can take data sets, find the bias in them, and actually remove it and skew it. A really sort of famous example of this is within the natural language processing space, where some of the early language models, if you said things like man is to doctor as woman is to, the models would predict nurse because it had learned this gender bias. But you can identify that dimension in the embedding and basically remove it. And so, yes, be deeply conscious about bias, but don't let its existence stop you from moving forward, because you can mitigate it.
What happens when you detect maybe even like a trained model might even reinforce a stereotype, that might not be culturally, welcomed?
We have seen even big companies make that mistake. Google released a model a couple of years ago that had some just unbelievably embarrassing bias in it. I won't even mention what it was. And it goes to,
Well,
it
just
goes back.
their recent one about injecting diversity into historical photos.
Yes, that's another great example. And that's an example where I think people were trying to do the right thing, right? They were trying to essentially make ethical or ethnic and racial bias sort of impossible for the model to perpetrate. But then you end up with these weird scenarios where they show, anachronistic representations of historic events that aren't even close to reality because they sort of over-indexed on that problem. So it's a really, really challenging problem. Not to least to mention, who decides what is biased and what's not biased. I mean, all models are going to be biased in one way or another because no two people are ever going to agree on everything. And so it's just a really, really deeply challenging problem at the heart of it.
Yeah, I remember the reason I asked the questions because I've seen it. And I mean, one of the very first large AI projects I ever worked on was about 5 or 6 years ago. And I was working with subprime automotive lending practices. And I was working with a bank that specialized in these types of loans. And I only had, 8 different columns of data. So we had like make, model, year of the car. We had which dealership it was bought from, a couple of other things. Like the amount of the loan, some of the payment terms. And so we ran it through in Google Cloud, they had this, it was like auto ML. So it was auto machine learning. Right. And what it would do is it would kind of cross tab all the data to look for patterns and matching. And you had to set it up to look for, it's like, okay, I want to solve for people paying the loan or not paying the loan, right? And so I remember when I optimized it, I want to see with these parameters, and I want to optimize for people paying the loan. It's like, wow, this is incredible. If they had had this black box of a model where they could send each loan to this and it would give them back a likelihood of payback, they would have saved $10 million. Mm-hmm. And then we flipped it and it's like, should we avoid the loan? So do we want the loan? That was the first one. So they would have made an extra $10 million. And then we said, should they avoid the loan? And it was, I think the difference was they would have saved $30 million. But out of the result of it, what was crazy to me is that there were some stereotypes. There were some make models of vehicles that were being bought. There was like, you might have seen them in like rap videos or something. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of reinforced a stereotype. And I was like, oh my gosh, like this is crazy. I cannot believe that this is there, with millions of records.
I absolutely understand the feeling because you would think that as these models, become more and more powerful and more and more, intelligent in quotes, that they would have the ability to understand and mitigate this bias inherently, but they really don't. And what's really crazy is a couple of things. Going back really briefly to the breast cancer risk prediction model, we've had to like just some crazy things to prevent the model from having bias along dimensions that we weren't even aware of. So, I mentioned we only showed the model images. I mean, the model never saw anything about the patient. It didn't. And
sounds like you showed them fractional images too.
That's right. And so the models didn't know names, ages, ethnicity. It knew nothing. Yet it could predict at a really, really high level the age of the patient, the race of the patient, the weight of the patient. And some of these make sense. Like the weight, maybe that makes sense. But it was astounding to us. We had a call with the head of AI at Stanford. They're developing some models in the healthcare space as well. And we were sharing our experiences, and they were seeing the exact same things. Literally, both of our team and their team had to put in place additional constraints on the loss function, which dictates how the model learns, to force it not to recognize and understand these additional parameters, which could have caused bias. And that's another example of like sort of hidden landmines that people new to AI may not really fully appreciate yet.
So in that kind of a case where the age of a patient might even be considered a risk factor, like in traditional medicine, like before A, it's like, okay, well, what's the age of this female? You know, what are the likelihood? What are the odds? Like those are the types of things that they're tracking for. How do you know when you're dealing with complex issues like this, whether it makes sense to take it out or not? Or are you just trying to be very scientific about it? It's like, regardless of the age, we don't care. We just want to understand if the images can be something. Or you're saying like, hey, no, I want to make an even more accurate model, so I'm going to add a couple more parameters to it. Like, how do you sort through those types of things?
Oh, that is a really, really great question. And I would say it's really not something where there's like a fixed answer. It varies wildly across projects, and it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. In this particular instance, it is well known that the dominant technique for breast cancer risk prediction, the Tyrer-Cuzick metric, has major racial bias in it, because when it was developed, it skewed unbelievably heavily towards the white population. So we knew that whatever we did, we had to make sure we didn't make the same mistakes that the previous approaches did. So we wanted the model to operate entirely on the image and not take any external factors in. The doctors can look at that. Like if the doctor's dealing with the patient and she's at an age where breast cancer is more likely, he and she will take those considerations into concern. The model's job is to just be absolutely agnostic. And one of the important things about that is that means it is as likely to accurately predict breast cancer risk in a woman who might be 25, which is an extremely unlikely scenario, as it would be with a woman who is 75, where obviously breast cancer risks are much more common.
That's some impressive work, and it just to kind of pick up where this part of the branch of the conversation started. I was watching an interview the other day at Stanford. I believe the old CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, I believe his name. And he was talking about how there are, thought leaders out there, like you would be a thought leader. We really don't know where all of this generative AI is going. And I think it's really important. I'd love for you to explain it, the difference for the audiences. Where have we been with machine learning and deep learning? And now we're in this new world following like the transformer architecture of AI models where they function a lot like a human brain. There's reasoning. It's a brand new world that really is only about 3 years old. Mm-hmm. I mean, well, the paper, that was a 2017, I think.
That's right.
But to see it practically roll out was really ChatGPT 3.5 and to the masses.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. ChatGPT, that initial rollout in late September 23 was important for a bunch of reasons. It obviously caught the world's imagination. It made people, I think, across the entire spectrum wake up and kind of realize the possibility of artificial intelligence. But it's also kind of in its own right really important because it's the first model in the history of artificial intelligence that was sort of broadly capable. So we've been talking off and on a little bit about this breast cancer risk prediction model. Unbelievable. It's going to save potentially millions of lives, but it's a domain specific model. It can do one thing. It can do it better than anybody in the world. And it's an amazingly powerful technique, but ChatGPT and the large language models we have right now can operate on many different types of problems. They can summarize content. They can classify. They can generate new content. They can generate essays or poems. I mean, you could just go on. And we're not even talking about the multimodal capabilities of these models, meaning the capability where the models can handle and ingest text, video, audio, and then output those media formats as well. So it's a major, major transformation. And the transformer architecture, like you said, is the key to that. What I think a lot of people don't realize is that we're really at day zero here. I say this all the time. We're day zero. I've been working in AI since the mid 90s. And I remember like it was yesterday thinking I was too late to the game. When I was studying in grad school, it kind of felt like everything had been figured out already. And now that we really do have a handle on the techniques and we're able to do things that, I and the rest of my colleagues always dreamed of, it's become really clear that this is just a tiny little step on the ladder that will move vertically in an exponential way soon. And here's why this is really important. Technologies like AI allow for an exponential improvement because they can help train themselves. All the models we're seeing right now that have come out recently, whether it's like Phi 3 from Microsoft or Llama 3.1 from Meta, they have all said in their white papers that they were trained on billions, sometimes tens of billions of synthetic tokens generated by previous models they built. So we're in that sort of self-positive feedback loop phase of AI where we're going to see exponential growth. And I'm one of those believers that we are headed towards sort of unlimited abundancy and all these kind of almost unimaginable things that will transpire in the next 50 years because we are just now entering this positive feedback loop at day zero.
It's kind of interesting because when you look at what the models and this software is able to do in the inference level of interpreting and taking in data, and whether or not you are augmenting the data with RAG or you're just using what the model's been trained on directly. But what I think so incredible is like that part of making the LLM do what it is doing right now is almost commoditized. It's gotten, it's not that hard. The hard part right now is for all the businesses out there to figure out, to figure out how they're going to integrate this technology in their business. And so it's building the pipes, it's building the data warehouses or the data lakes or whatever data structure you're talking about. But it's like, where's the data going so that these LLMs can actually help these businesses function? And it's just all of that. And then what you've talked about earlier about security and all those things, that was an elegant solution, by the way, of you guys chopping up the data before it came in. But like, look, it seems to me that the problem set has changed dramatically.
I would totally agree with that. And mostly for the better. So it's definitely the case that if you're trying to do something like build a foundational model from scratch in one of these large language models, you would need, internet scale data and internet scale training resources. Meta said that they trained their Llama 3 model, which is their most recent state-of-the-art language model. It's, you can think in your mind out there if you're listening to this, it's like ChatGPT. They trained that for 2 months on 16,000 NVIDIA H100s. Those run about $20,000 a piece. But the beautiful part about this is you can now, to your point, go take these open source language models and use them as the basis for all kinds of downstream tasks. And the reason that works is they are broadly knowledgeable. And like you mentioned, hooking it up with like a RAG pipeline. So hooking it up in a way where it can access your company's proprietary information, that is relatively straightforward now. And the cost and the risk level associated with that is minuscule. I mean, I would off the top of my head say, compared to what it would have cost as recently as 5 years ago, it is probably, 1/10,000th the amount of both effort and dollar cost. And the return on the investment is going to be, really, really high compared to the results you would have gotten with that big outlay back then.
But it was still worth it back then. Yeah, absolutely. And the amazing thing is, I think most businesses are, this is not an exaggeration, most businesses are not sure how to take that first step. And it's reasonable, it's understandable. This is a big technological change. It's difficult sometimes to separate the hype from the reality. And you don't want to go put a bunch of money into something that's going to fail. And the reality is
the majority of AI projects still fail, and they fail because lack of internal alignment, maybe overhyped expectations, not understanding, like you said a second ago, what is necessary to have your data in order and things like that. So I would encourage businesses to do a couple things. One, don't rush out and go build AI just so you have AI. Make sure you have a plan and develop a strategy and go assess what your business needs. If you align on ROI before you go build anything, you are much, much more likely to be one of the handful of companies that has a successful AI deployment. And then the other thing is that these initiatives don't have to be moonshots. Most companies don't even have sort of rudimentary AI models in place that can do things that would be astoundingly useful. We've already mentioned a couple of them, whether it's a sales optimization or churn prediction or price or product improvements. All of those are relatively low-hanging fruit, not to mention building, internal chatbots that might answer HR questions and things like that based upon your internal documentation. So I would just encourage businesses, don't take the approach of, ready, fire, aim. Have a strategy, have a plan, and start with something with real ROI and start small. And then you will build up confidence over time. And it can be transformative to your business.
Well, to me, I think what you're talking about with the strategy component, when people ask me how they should get started with AI, my first question, my first advice to them is like, I tell them, I was like, just look at how you do business now. Start with, what databases do you have? Like, think about your entire company. So like, as an advertising, marketing, digital agency, what we have is we have a CRM. We have advertising campaigns that generate data. We have QuickBooks data. We have, we might have phone logs or things like that, right? So those are all the things in your business where like data comes from. And then it's like, okay, for any model to do something with it, it has to be in a place it can get to it. And it might even be the actual data, or it might be a copy of the data that's kept up to date, right?
That's right.
And so then from there, the next thing I tell them, and I'm bringing this up because you didn't mention it, but it's like, look at your whole infrastructure. Like, is there anything that you do that's tedious, monotonous, people hate it, it's repetitive? Like, look for things like that. And like, those are like no regret things you can do.
That is such a great point, because to maybe kind of give a couple other examples that might be useful. The idea that modern machine learning can automate or be predictive is 100% true. But one of the things that a lot of people may not be thinking of is it can do these perceptual tests, like you mentioned. Imagine you have some sort of pipeline where you're paying people, and all they're doing is extracting information from like PDF documents, or they're verifying that, contracts are signed, or they're checking that numbers add up or something like that. All of that would have been impossible to automate in any real way as recently as 5 years ago. Now, with the capabilities of both the language and the computer vision models, all of that can be readily automated. And in the corner cases where there are issues around data quality, then those you can surface to humans. So you might be able to say, like, we're going to take 80% of somebody's job that's repetitive and automate that, and let them focus on the 20% that really requires judgment and thought and following up. You may have to pick up the phone and call somebody to verify something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way to get started. And I love everywhere where I've been looking and over the past couple years, as we get into this new chapter in all of our lives, there's things like you mentioned, like chatbots, like where you can talk to these. You've got all this documentation, you've got these policies, these company handbooks, you've got technical support manuals, you've got histories and histories of support tickets. Those are the types of things that can be integrated relatively cheaply and easily and see massive returns quickly.
Yeah, I just sticking with that example because I think it's a great example. Any company with a help desk, you could automatically triage incoming requests. You could automatically classify them, summarize them, prioritize them, all of that type of stuff that would, that requires a deep understanding of the semantic content of the messages is entirely possible now. And so, I think that's a great sort of example of relatively low risk, low hanging fruit opportunities that companies can use to kind of take a first step forward in this wave of AI adoption.
But even that step, you might benefit with working with a company like KUNGFU.AI, because you guys are going to be able to come in and say, well, because you're using this system, we're going to use this model. Because it's private, we're going to use Llama and it's going to be hosted locally. And,
right.
Or we're going to do it in a private cloud over here. Like, those are the types of things where it still might behoove you and save you money and get you where you want to go faster by working with a consultancy.
Well, I obviously completely agree. We like to help companies succeed and get to the point where they don't need us anymore. So whether you need strategy and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I even get started, or how do I, what is real, what's not real, what do I need to do on the data front or the engineering front? We work with companies like that every day, all the way to the other end of the spectrum to go build things from scratch. And the beautiful thing about that is we're technology agnostic. We're not pushing any product, any approach. And so we can come in and act as this sort of, purely objective third party to assess your opportunities, your needs. And then if you need execution on them, great. Increasingly, there are opportunities for people to leverage, as you said, open source models, and you can use them as a foundation for new capabilities. And then lastly, I think we're at this. It's like it's 1997 with the .com wave, where most companies have not embraced internet. Most companies don't have internet development or internet savvy developers within their teams, even if they're software companies. And companies were classified as either internet companies or non-internet companies.
Brick and mortar.
And not anymore, right? Nobody is a non-internet company anymore. And we're going to see the same thing with AI. It will be another tool in the tool belt. It'll be the most powerful tool ever built, but it will just be another tool in the tool belt. And within 10 years, everybody will be used to it.
Yeah, and I think this experience that we've gone through, because I remember I had built my first website in 1996, and I remember thinking, wow, this is really cool. And before you know it, I've got all these other people asking me to build websites, and so I'm busy building websites, but I never made anything, never made a product that I tried to sell it as a product, although I should have. And so when I saw this new wave of AI come through, I'm like, you know what? I've done this before. I'm going to make sure that I allocate resources to creating things. So I think now that we're kind of in the mix, I think it calls our attention to some of the business models that we've seen. Like, for example, NVIDIA leveraged open source better than I've ever seen a company ever use open source before, because they are the hardware company with the GPUs that do this AI processing, this parallel processing better than anyone. And the whole platform, the kernels, everything was this CUDA core, this CUDA type software kernel that does the processing, and it was all open source. So they wanted all these people to learn on their hardware, and then they turn around and they get to sell the hardware. And I'm just wondering, and I'm sure you know more about that than I do, but I'm wondering what other new business models we're going to see. Like you just brought up, we want to get them to the point where they don't need us anymore, but wouldn't it be nice if it was a SaaS solution we gave them, to where as long as they kept using it, we keep making money? So that's a win-win in my book. How do you see some of the business models and the way that people are doing what you do, or some of the other things that are happening out there? Where are we headed?
I completely agree with sort of the analogy you just made, and I'm really excited about the future. We, as I said, KUNGFU.AI, we're an AI strategy and engineering firm, so we'll do custom strategy and custom engineering. We also do a little managed services, so if you need help, hiring the team or managing models, we're more than happy to do that as well. But I think the heart of your question is really interesting. Right now, it's a pretty hard time to be a product company with an AI. And if you look at the funding landscape, there are a lot of sort of acqui-hires going on right now that are essentially disguising the fact that some of these product initiatives didn't really pan out from a revenue profitability perspective, but the teams are very, very talented. And part of the reason is because we're in this massive wave of disruption. My background, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've done 10 startups, but KUNGFU.AI is the only company in my entire professional history that's a services company. And we chose to do that very purposely 7 years ago because we looked at the state of AI. We looked at the speed with which it was improving. And it was really clear to us that anything we might do within the product space was going to probably be undercut every 18 months. And we were going to have to start from scratch, rebuild it on some new type of foundational technology, and go again. And the hardest thing about that is when you have spent a lot of money going down, some sort of approach, it's kind of hard to go raise capital very often and pivot and disrupt yourself. And so most of those companies have had real challenges going to market. Even I think you can use OpenAI as maybe the best example of an AI-based product company out in the world. They're struggling because you have other people like Meta undercutting them and just open sourcing, putting $100 million into a model, then open sourcing it, the Llama model we've mentioned. So I expect the next few years to be continually pretty frothy because we're not even close to any type of reduction in the acceleration of this AI curve.
I feel like you should say the next few months instead of years.
I think this is probably the hardest technological transformational wave any of us will ever experience in our lifetime because we're still at that almost vertical part of the exponential curve, and it's not clear when it's going to start tapering off. But you're right. I think people will find this fascinating, but at KUNGFU.AI, we carve out every Friday. We call it Lab Day. We don't do any billable work. Everybody within the company, everybody in the engineering team, we read white papers. We do guest lectures. We do prototyping on different projects. We're literally having to spend 20% of our billable hours dedicated to just trying to stay up to date. That's how fast things are moving, to your point.
Yeah, it's going lightning fast. And I think a good rule of thumb is, because we're going to get into some of the ethics of all of this because people are scared about the workforce and the changes that are going to happen with the workforce. I think it's a safe bet that any task that can be automated will. Whether it's going to be automated by somebody, right? And you mentioned these open source models. The genie is out of the bottle. Like, it is out of the bottle. And
That's right.
And Llama, even if they stopped open sourcing it today, there's going to be other open sourced models that come out that are also going to be really, really good. And it's like, it's okay if your model isn't, ChatGPT 4 Opus or whatever, it's okay. It's okay if it's not that, because there are a lot of open source models that are good at things that are good enough.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I agree. I totally agree.
And so I think from an entrepreneur standpoint, because all of our businesses are products per se, we should definitely expect that we will all be disrupted, and anything that can be automated will be automated. And I mean, it's shocking. I remember my first experience with ChatGPT 3.5. I remember I was asking it marketing questions, and I was going, "Oh my God, this is a really good strategy that this AI engine just came up with."
Yeah.
It's like I could present this tomorrow to like half my clients, and they think I was a genius.
That was kind of my exact reaction as well. As I asked it a question, a very sort of expert level question where I would be able to very quickly, tell if it was BSing, and it was flawless. And then I took some strategy documents that I'd put together and some technical documents, and I was like, and I asked it for feedback. I said, help me understand, are there any shortcomings associated with the approach here? And it immediately came back and said, this looks pretty good, but you're not covering this topic, or it's a little light in this area. And I went and assessed it. It was absolutely right. And so I would maybe even go one step further, which is not only can anything right now that a human can do, not only will we be able to automate that, and that might sound terrifying, but hold on. Not only will we be able to automate that, but it's going to be augmentative, because we're going to be in a situation, I think, in the next 10 years where it's very likely, I'd place a bet that we're going to have AGI, artificial general intelligence. That means these AI systems that are broadly intelligent and have reasoning capabilities that are far beyond what we can even see with ChatGPT right now. And once we have that level of sort of AI capability, we've hit this AGI. I think a couple of things are going to happen. One is they're going to become sort of like our guardian angel. They're going to be helping us make decisions and alerting us and looking out for us sort of 24/7. And that's going to be magical, because we'll never be late for another meeting. We'll never forget about a flight, picking somebody up, or whatever it may be. Simple things like that. But more interestingly, they'll help us with our work, and they'll help guide us in really, really detailed ways. And that is going to also apply to science and research, meaning, so we're going to have a positive loop there. And if you think about let's take biology for an example. I took part in a biological machine learning hackathon a couple of weeks ago at the University of Texas here in Austin. And it was amazing. The university is using multiple different state-of-the-art AI models, none of which existed even 3 years ago, to do this competition to design amino acid sequences that then convert into proteins that will attach to a specific part of a receptor on cancer, so that they can then have this chain reaction effect that will pull in the T cells and kill the cancer. This is a hackathon to go develop, bleeding edge AI treatments. And this was not only was this, are all these, PhD students solving this task that seems almost unimaginary, but they're using AI models that are capable of doing things like protein fold prediction. That was considered one of the most unsolved problems of biology as recently as 3 years ago. And so we're going to see this, which we have not seen yet. We're going to see this positive enforcement loop on research and science. And when that takes off for real, we're going to see leaps in capabilities that would normally have taken like 20, 30, 40 years, and they're going to happen in 6 months. And so that's the reason it's so difficult to predict about what's going to happen much more beyond 10 years, because we're going to be entering this just amazing age of science that's unlike anything we've ever seen in human history.
Is there any way, so part of what you said, I mean, that sounds phenomenally positive, like your perspective on that right there. The couple of things, like you talked about how the AI can be predicting and predictive for us, and it can be looking out for us. Well, in order to get there, we have to completely forget about privacy, in some ways. And then also, because I'm it's really cool to hear that you participated in that research. I heard about this, another like genome type company, and they were doing protein fold, type things with antibiotics, all the most popular antibiotics we have today. And they were able to take all 40 of the most popular antibiotics and make an even better antibiotic based off of those. And I think that's just unbelievably positive. But the same exact technology, now that all these open source models are like out of the genie, or the genie's out of the bottle, whatever, like it can be used for bioweapons too. So how do we like even keep an eye on this? Like because it could go super great or super bad.
Mm-hmm. This is the part about AI that I think is the most difficult to really have a strong sense on what the best path is. Because, like all technologies, the more powerful the technology is, the more asymmetric the beneficial capacity it has and destructive capacity. So if you think about, nuclear weapons, probably the most, amazingly terrifying asymmetry of any technology we've ever built. It's this incredibly sophisticated scientific accomplishment, but it can be used to destroy entire cities. I think some of the lessons we learned from the atomic weapons over the last 80 years, we're going to have to apply to AI, meaning we're going to have to, especially as these systems get extremely capable.
I mean, just last week, you see OpenAI inviting the Department of Defense in to come basically help them with safety.
Yeah.
That's right. Hey, we just want to show you what we're doing.
That's right. Yeah.
And there's your DARPA scientists to think through this stuff. And of course,
that's right.
Department of Defense, they're not there to help fertilize the fields, they're taking bad guys off the battlefield. So, I mean, it's going to be
asymmetry.
I think that's
and it's asymmetry. And it's unfortunately, to the best of my abilities to think about this, I don't think that there is some sort of magical shortcut. The universe tends towards entropy. Destruction is easier than creation. As we get more and more powerful technologies, the risk of destruction or those technologies being used in bad ways grows. And so it is the one downside in any type, not just AI, it's the one downside, or maybe the biggest downside of any type of incredibly important and powerful technology.
Well, Ron, I really appreciate you talking to us today. And I could talk with you for at least a couple more hours easy. So if I ever come to Austin, I'm going to look you up.
Absolutely. This was a blast. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you joining us. Where can people follow you and learn more about what you guys do?
Yeah, the company is called KUNGFU.AI. If you want to reach out to me via email, I'm just Ron, R-O-N, at KUNGFU.AI. And if you're interested in, an AI podcast, we have a podcast called Hidden Layers, and we'll do a combination of sort of, deep technical dives on stuff, but we'll also talk very frequently about project level work. So if you want to kind of get a view into some of the practical elements of building AI, check it out, Hidden Layers.
We'll definitely do that. That's my favorite type of content to learn about with AI, because it's cool to talk about all this theory, but if you can't use it, I mean, what's it worth? So
exactly.
Ron, again, thank you for joining us. And you can find us anywhere where podcasts are found across the Bake More Pies social media feed and the Law of Relevancy feed. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.